In this short video, I'm going to provide some safe tips for takeoff in a high-performance airplane like the Malibu. I won't be discussing the obvious issues of density, altitude, and piloting technique, even though they're important to a safe takeoff, because these subjects are extensively discussed elsewhere. What I would like to present is the method I use to determine that I'm getting the proper acceleration. How do we know that as we advance the throttle for takeoff, we'll rotate at the appropriate place on the runway and not have an extended run causing us to use up way too much runway or possibly run off the end of the runway? Being competent pilots, we've already checked density, altitude, and required runway length. We're well trained. We know the proper takeoff technique. But how do we know that our engine is performing properly? This is an especially critical question on a short field. Can we base our decisions solely on the engine gauges? I don't think so, because engine gauges do not tell the whole story. It's necessary that the engine gauges show the indications of full power, but not all problems show up on the gauges, particularly with a constant speed prop that can mask a problem that would be more evident with a fixed pitch prop. Also, we could have an accessory loading the engine, such as an air conditioner or compressor. A bad plug may not show up. Even a magneto that we have inadvertently left off during the run-up may not show up on the gauges. A classic serious problem is a fuel leak. Even though the gauges indicate sufficient flow, all the fuel may not be flowing to the injectors. The gauges also have errors, and by the way, not all problems are in the engine. Drag associated with low tires, brakes, or other drag, such as the air conditioner condenser on a Cherokee hanging out underneath the airplane, all of these could slow the takeoff roll significantly. I'm going to give you a technique that I use to make sure that my plane is accelerating properly on my takeoff run. Let's use a departure on runway 32 at my home airport, 1 Bravo Niner. As we taxi out, we can see that the exits and entries to the runway are very obvious from the airplane. And we can use these points to measure our acceleration, as I'll show in just a moment. I start my takeoff roll at the very end of the runway, and I use that first turnoff on the right as my measurement point. Let's go now to an actual flight where I demonstrated this technique to another pilot.
Mansfield traffic, Malibu 9109 Mike, departing 32 Mansfield. What I do is I hold the brakes, I bring the power up to 2,000, check everything, and then go, and then there's a taxiway there. You can see where it's plowed, about 600 feet. I need to be at about 50 knots crossing that, okay? Then everything is running normally. Now we're at max gross weight, so it may take a little bit longer, but I doubt it. Okay, there's 2,000 RPM, things look good. The plane is accelerating normally. Airspeed's alive. We're at 50. We're crossing the taxiway, 60 knots. So we're good, we're accelerating. We will be fine. 80 knots is rotation speed in this plane.
So in summary, what I've done is I've picked a point along my takeoff run and got accustomed to the speed that I'm at when I cross that point, so I can use that as a check on every takeoff. At your home field, you can over time become familiar with the speed you usually obtain by the checkpoint, but you can also figure out the checkpoint speed in any field if you know the distance to the checkpoint. We can measure the distance to the checkpoint in apps like ForeFlight that give a satellite picture of the runway environment. At 1 Bravo Niner, the distance is 570 feet. After many takeoffs at Mansfield, I've determined that I need to be at about 50 knots in my Malibu crossing my checkpoint. But how would we calculate that if it were the first time we were doing a takeoff at that airport? The first step is to determine the takeoff roll distance in the POH for the conditions present on the day we're taking off and for the configuration that we're going to use. For the takeoff I demonstrated earlier, I used full power and a rotation speed of about 77 knots, and we had a dry paved runway. At 0 degrees at sea level, at max gross weight, we needed about 1,600 feet for our ground roll. according to the POH. So the question we want to answer is, how fast should the airplane be moving by the time we get to our checkpoint? Let's call the speed at the checkpoint VP. We start off at 0, and we want to calculate what is VP for that checkpoint distance. VP will be an estimate or an approximation because we're making an assumption that our acceleration is uniform across the takeoff run. And we know as we get faster, drag increases, so it won't be specifically uniform, but we can get a pretty good idea of what that speed should be. The speed at the end of the takeoff run will be VR, our rotation speed, and that's 77 knots for the Malibu, and that should occur for our demonstrated takeoff at 1,600 feet. 77 knots is 128 feet per second. Let's use feet per second for our calculations. Now it's important to understand that if we start off at 0 and we end up at 128 feet per second, our average speed across that ground run was 64 feet per second. Why is that? Because to get the average, you take the two speeds, add them together, and divide by 2. That gives you 64 feet per second average. Let's look at how long that run takes. Well, rate times time equals distance, so if we want the time it takes, we divide distance by rate. In other words, the distance by the average speed. The answer is 25 seconds, and if you go back and look at the elapsed time on the takeoff that was shown earlier, you'll find that it is 25 seconds. Now, just as your distance is given by your speed times the time, the speed is given by the acceleration times the time. So that means I can figure out what the acceleration is for my airplane. So if I start off at 0 and I accelerate to 128 feet per second uniformly, and that takes 25 seconds, then my acceleration is 5 feet per second squared. And for those who think in G's, that turns out to be about 0.16 G's. Now to figure out the velocity or speed passing the checkpoint, we're going to need a little high school algebra. And the reason for that is because we know the distance and we know the acceleration, but we don't know the amount of time it takes to get to our point. So we'll need to figure that out. Bear with me on the algebra because it's going to be worth it. We're going to get an answer that's going to be very useful. We know that rate times time equals distance. Since we're accelerating uniformly, we'll need to use the average rate or average speed times time to calculate our distance. We can rearrange that so that the time is equal to the distance divided by the average speed. The average speed that we're talking about here is averaged from 0 to the speed crossing the checkpoint. So VP plus 0 divided by 2, or VP over 2, is our average speed on the way to the checkpoint. Let's plug that into our formula. Since we want to divide by VP over 2, it's the same as multiplying by 2 over VP. So time is equal to distance times 2 over VP. We also know that VP is equal to acceleration times time. In other words, the amount of time that it takes to go from start to our checkpoint times our acceleration gives us the value VP. Now that we have two equations for VP, we can use that to take time out of the equations. We'll use the high school method of substitution to get rid of time. Now we have an equation for VP that has only known quantities, that is acceleration and distance. So now we can figure out what VP is by rearranging terms. VP squared is equal to the acceleration times the distance times 2. Plug in the numbers, work out the math, and we get that crossing the point should be at 45 knots, which is pretty close to what I've just observed after many, many takeoffs, that I like to be at 50 knots crossing that entry to the runway. Our equation for our speed rolling down the runway works for any distance along the runway, including the full distance of the takeoff roll. This leads to a very important result if we look at the ratio between the speed at any point on the runway and the final rotation speed. At any point as we accelerate down the runway, the ratio of the distance to that point and the full roll distance is equal to the ratio of the squares of the speed at that point and the rotation speed. Now we have the formula that you've been waiting for. To calculate your velocity passing your checkpoint, take the ratio of the checkpoint distance and the takeoff roll distance, take the square root of that and multiply it by your rotation speed, and that's your speed passing the checkpoint. This leads to another very interesting result. Suppose that your takeoff roll distance is the full length of the runway. What should your speed be at the halfway point? Well, the ratio of the halfway point over the full length is 1/2. So the square root of 1/2 is the number that you want here. It's 0.7. And that leads to the finding that you must reach 70% of your rotation speed by halfway to the end of the runway. If you don't, you will go off the runway. If you're having trouble understanding that, just consider that on the second half of the runway, you're moving much faster. Your average speed is much more than it was on the first half, so you use up that runway much faster. Look again at this result because it shows an important idea. As we travel along the takeoff roll, the speed squared is proportional to the distance traveled. Let me show you the critical consequences of this equation by explaining one more chart to erase any lingering doubt. Column 1 of this chart shows our progress accelerating to rotation speed, VR. At 10%, our speed is 0.1 times VR. At 30%, it's 0.3 times VR, and so forth. Column 2 shows our progress in terms of distance to the end of the takeoff roll. At 10% of VR, we are 1% of the distance we will need. At 70% of VR, we have used 49% of the full roll distance that will be needed. Now look at column 3. It shows how much of the roll distance we have yet to go. At 10% of VR, we have 99% of the roll ahead of us. That makes sense. At 50% of VR, we have 75% of the roll ahead of us. Now, this is really important. At 70% of VR, we have 51% of the roll to go. In other words, whatever distance we used, we still have a little bit more than that yet to go. So if that distance happens to be half the runway, or more than half the runway, we need more than the remaining runway to reach VR. Now, I've heard some pilots ask why runway length doesn't enter into this calculation, and how can this be true on a 10,000-foot runway? Well, if your acceleration is so anemic that you need 5,000 feet to get to 70% of your rotation speed, that anemic acceleration will require another 5,000 feet to reach VR. It's simple math. It's important to note that most airspeed indicators do not indicate accurately below stall speed, and most have no markings at all below 40 knots. So if you've selected a checkpoint with a crossing speed below 40 knots, you can't use the airspeed indicator. Now, acceleration is more correctly measured in terms of ground speed, so if you have a WAAS GPS, you could use ground speed. So why do I recommend airspeed? It's because we use airspeed for rotation, and I like to keep it simple. In choosing your checkpoint, keep in mind that it needs to be far enough down the runway so that on a typical takeoff you have gained measurable speed, but not so far that you can't stop on the pavement if you don't like the acceleration. Another factor is to correctly set your elevator trim for a speed near your rotation speed. Correct trim makes it easy to rotate with precision at VR. VR in the Malibu is 77 knots. As you saw in the demo earlier, I use 80 knots. And that's because 80 is easy to read on the airspeed indicator. Now suppose you're based at a very long runway. Do you really care which one of these departures you use? I'd say the answer is yes. You should still have a checkpoint and check your acceleration, because that will tell you whether there's anything wrong with the airplane, whether you have too much drag, a low tire, dragging brake, or a poorly performing engine. You'll know it because you didn't reach the correct speed at your checkpoint.